The morning mist clung to the Colorado mountains like a shroud, and through it came the crack of a rifle that defied physics. At 1,247 yards, through swirling wind and shifting light, a single bullet found its mark with surgical precision. Target exploded in a shower of orange clay, and for a moment, the entire Clearwater Shooting Academy fell silent. Then came the whispered question that would change everything. Who the hell made that shot? Sarah Mitchell lowered the borrowed rifle and handed it back to the stunned instructor, her expression as calm as mountain lake water. "Range is clear," she announced, her voice carrying across the facility with quiet authority. "Next group. You're up." The students and instructors stood frozen, minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. A shot that should have been impossible, made by the Academy's safety officer, the woman they all considered harmless. But Sarah had already turned away, walking back toward the range house with the same measured steps she took every morning at 6:30 sharp. Her worn hiking boots found their familiar path, her eyes scanning the facility with practiced efficiency, cataloging safety violations and equipment issues that others missed. To everyone at Clearwater, she was just the quiet woman who checked credentials and enforced range rules. Competent, certainly, but unremarkable in a world where loud voices and tactical gear commanded attention. They had no idea they were watching a ghost walk among them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah's alarm clock never had the chance to sound. She woke each morning at 5:15 with the precision of an internal chronometer that had been calibrated by years of discipline and purpose. Her apartment in downtown Pine Ridge reflected the same minimalist efficiency as her daily routine. Clean lines, functional furniture, and no personal photographs adorning the sparse surfaces. The only decoration was a small wooden box on her knitstand, worn smooth by handling, that she never opened in front of anyone. Her morning ritual began with 50 push-ups on the hardwood floor, counting silently in her mind. Not for fitness, though her lean frame suggested excellent conditioning, but for something deeper. Each repetition carried weight beyond physical exertion, memories that shaped her movements with mechanical precision. The coffee maker had been programmed the night before, and she drank her black coffee from the same ceramic mug while reviewing weather conditions and range schedules on her tablet. By 6 o'clock, Sarah was walking through the front gates of Clearwater Shooting Academy, her Academy-issued polo shirt tucked neatly into dark jeans, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that revealed no jewelry except for small silver studs in her ears. The security code came automatically to her fingers, and she disabled the alarm system with movements that spoke of absolute familiarity with the routine. The academy sprawled across 200 acres of Colorado mountain terrain, featuring indoor tactical training bays, outdoor pistol ranges, and a precision rifle course that stretched nearly 1,500 yards across natural terrain. When weather permitted, the crack of gunfire echoed through the valley from dawn until dusk, a symphony of training that prepared law enforcement officers, military personnel, and civilian enthusiasts for everything from basic marksmanship to advanced tactical scenarios. Sarah's inspection routine covered every inch of the facility with methodical thoroughness. She checked target systems, examined barriers for damage, tested communication equipment, and verified that safety protocols were properly posted and equipment readily accessible. Her reports were legendary among the staff for their detail and accuracy, documenting issues that other safety officers might miss, and providing solutions that consistently impressed visiting inspectors. The other instructors respected her work, but knew almost nothing about her life beyond these mountains. She had appeared 18 months ago with impeccable references and credentials that satisfied all background checks. Her application listed 8 years as a police dispatcher in Denver, followed by specialized training in range safety and firearms instruction. Nothing unusual, nothing that would raise questions or invite deeper inquiry into her past. Her efficiency was remarkable, even by the Academy's exacting standards. Equipment failures were virtually non-existent on her watch. Safety incidents had dropped to zero, and the facility consistently passed inspections that made other training centers struggle. Students learned to trust her judgment implicitly, understanding that when Sarah Mitchell spoke about safety protocols, lives depended on listening. But there were moments when something else showed through the carefully constructed facade. The way she moved through tactical scenarios with an unconscious grace that suggested muscle memory beyond civilian training. The comments she made about ballistics and environmental factors that revealed knowledge far deeper than safety manual requirements. The manner in which her eyes continuously scanned surroundings, cataloging potential threats and escape routes with the automatic assessment from one trained for hostile environments. Her colleagues attributed these quirks to natural talent and dedicated study. Sarah encouraged this interpretation by deflecting personal questions with practiced ease, mentioning general interest in shooting sports and a desire to work in the outdoor recreation industry. Nothing that would invite further scrutiny into the source of her expertise or the reason she had chosen this particular form of service. The wooden box in her apartment contained items that would have shattered her carefully maintained anonymity. 3 sets of military identification tags, worn smooth by years of handling. Challenge coins from units that didn't officially exist. Commendation citations classified at levels that civilian contractors weren't supposed to access. Evidence of a life lived in shadows, serving in places where legends were born and heroes died without recognition. She had been Sergeant Sarah Mitchell then, though that name appeared in no public records, and her service history was buried beneath classifications that would remain sealed for decades. The woman who checked range safety at a civilian academy had once operated in 17 countries, engaging targets that threatened national security with precision that defied mathematical probability. The transition from that world to this one had been deliberate and complete. Sarah had erased every trace of her previous existence, choosing anonymity over recognition, peaceful service over the burden of being remembered as something larger than human. The quiet contractor who arrived early and left late, who never missed a safety briefing and never complained about additional responsibilities, was exactly what she wanted to be. But ghosts had a way of being discovered, especially when they tried too hard to remain hidden. And at Clearwater Shooting Academy, where precision met passion and students learned to trust their equipment with their dreams, the past had a way of revealing itself through the very skills one tried to suppress. The morning that Sarah's carefully constructed anonymity began to unravel started like any other. Coffee, inspection routine, and the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders as she prepared the facility for another day of training. She had no way of knowing that Brad Kellerman had been questioning her qualifications for weeks, or that his insecurities would soon transform professional oversight into something far more personal and dangerous. Brad arrived at the academy around 7:30, driving a lifted pickup truck that announced his presence long before the engine shut off. His tactical gear was expensive and meticulously maintained, though anyone with real experience could see that most of it served decorative rather than functional purposes. He carried himself like a man who had never questioned his right to command others, never doubted his qualifications to judge their performance. His military service had been entirely stateside, managing logistics for training exercises that prepared others for combat you would never see. But Brad had parlayed that limited experience into ownership of Clearwater Academy, using inherited money to purchase a facility that had been renowned for excellence under its previous management. The transition had not been smooth. Under Brad's ownership, the academy had lost several major training contracts and experienced a troubling increase in safety incidents. Experienced instructors had left for other positions, citing philosophical differences with management that everyone understood but nobody discussed openly. The facility's reputation for excellence was eroding, replaced by questions about standards and competence that reflected poorly on Brad's leadership. Sarah represented everything that threatened Brad's carefully constructed image. Her quiet competence highlighted his own limitations. Her safety record made his management decisions appear questionable, and her obvious expertise in areas where he claimed authority exposed the superficial nature of his qualifications. Worse, she was a woman working in a field where Brad believed traditional gender roles should prevail. The confrontation began with Brad's announcement during the morning staff meeting that he would be implementing new oversight procedures for all Academy personnel. His presentation focused on accountability and standardization, but everyone in the room understood that the real target was Sarah's independence and the respect she commanded from students and staff. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Excellence in firearms training requires more than technical competence, Brad declared, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never doubted his right to judge others. It requires understanding of tactical principles, commitment to proper hierarchy, and recognition that some responsibilities require backgrounds that go beyond civilian training. The words were carefully chosen, designed to question not just Sarah's qualifications, but her right to work in roles that Brad considered fundamentally masculine. She felt the weight of every gaze in the room as he prepared to make her an example of what he perceived as the Academy's declining standards. Sarah maintained her neutral expression, the same professional mask she wore during safety briefings and incident reviews. But something beneath the surface began to stir. Instincts that had been dormant for 18 months, awakening in response to a threat she recognized all too well. She had dealt with men like Brad before, officers who confused rank with competence, who mistake volume for leadership. The meeting concluded with Brad's announcement that he would be conducting personal evaluations of all staff members, starting with those whose performance might benefit from closer supervision. The message was received and understood by everyone present. Sarah had been marked as a target, and Brad intended to demonstrate his authority by systematically undermining her position at the Academy. As the staff dispersed to begin their daily routines, Sarah felt the familiar weight of challenge settling on her shoulders. She had thought 18 months of excellent performance would be enough to establish her place at the Academy without question. But Brad's insecurities demanded a different kind of response, one that would test her commitment to remaining hidden in plain sight. The wooden box in her apartment seemed to call to her as she went through her morning inspection routine. 3 sets of tags, worn smooth by handling. Reminders of comrades who had trusted her with their lives and paid the ultimate price for service to something larger than themselves. They had died believing in excellence over politics, competence over connections, and the idea that success mattered more than personal recognition. Brad's campaign against her threatened the only form of service she had left, the quiet dedication that allowed her to honor their memory through ensuring others would be better prepared for challenges she prayed they would never face. The irony wasn't lost on her that a man who had never seen combat was questioning the qualifications of someone whose service record would have humbled his entire command structure. But Sarah had learned patience in places where impatience meant death. She had developed discipline under circumstances that would have broken weaker minds. And she understood that some battles were worth fighting, even when victory required revealing truths she had worked hard to keep buried. The ghost was stirring, and Sarah wasn't certain she had the strength to keep it contained much longer. But perhaps it was time to stop trying. Perhaps Brad Kellerman was about to learn the difference between commanding respect and earning it, between wearing authority and embodying it, between talking about excellence and demonstrating it with precision that spoke louder than words. The Academy's precision rifle range stretched across natural terrain that challenged even experienced marksmen. Rolling hills, varying elevations, and mountain winds created conditions that separated technicians from artists. Students learned to read environmental factors, calculate trajectories, and make shots that required not just skill, but intuitive understanding of ballistics and atmospheric conditions. Sarah's duties as safety officer required her to observe training sessions and ensure proper protocols were followed. She positioned herself at the range control station, where she could monitor multiple shooting positions and communicate with instructors through radio headsets. Her presence was barely noticed by students focused on their targets, but her watchful oversight provided the safety net that allowed them to push their limits without crossing dangerous lines. The morning session featured advanced law enforcement, officers working on precision shooting under stress. The course required them to engage targets at distances ranging from 200 to 800 yards, simulating scenarios where accuracy meant the difference between mission success and tragic failure. Most students struggled with shots beyond 400 yards, their groups opening up as environmental factors overwhelmed their technical preparation. Brad appeared on the range mid-morning, carrying expensive spotting equipment and positioning himself where his presence would be most visible to students and instructors. He began offering commentary on shooting techniques and environmental considerations, demonstrating the kind of superficial knowledge that impressed civilians but revealed its limitations to experienced practitioners. Sarah watched from her control position as Brad's observations became increasingly inaccurate and potentially dangerous. He was advising students to ignore wind conditions that would significantly affect bullet trajectory, suggesting shooting positions that compromised both accuracy and safety, and making claims about ballistics that had no basis in physics or practical experience. The situation deteriorated when one of the officers, following Brad's advice, nearly missed the target entirely at 300 yards. The bullet struck the earthen backstop well below the intended impact point, creating a situation that could have been dangerous if the range hadn't been properly designed and maintained. Sarah immediately called a ceasefire and moved to address the safety concern. "Range is cold," she announced over the communication system. "All weapons safe, all personnel remain in position until further notice." Her voice carried absolute authority, the kind of command presence that brooked no argument or delay. Students and instructors froze immediately, understanding that when Sarah Mitchell called a safety halt, something serious had occurred. She approached the shooting position where the errant shot had originated, her movements deliberate and professional. The officer looked embarrassed and confused, uncertain about what had gone wrong with his technique. Sarah examined the rifle, checked the scope settings, and quickly identified the problem. "Your windage adjustment is off by approximately 6 minutes of angle," she explained calmly, "given current wind conditions and the ballistic coefficient of your ammunition. You need to compensate 3.5 minutes to the right for a 300-yard shot in this crosswind." Her diagnosis was precise and immediately correctable, delivered without condescension or judgment. Brad approached the position with obvious irritation, his authority challenged by Sarah's intervention. "Hayes," he said, using her last name, with deliberate formality, "I was providing instruction to these officers. Your role is safety oversight, not marksmanship coaching." The confrontation attracted attention from other students and instructors, who recognized the tension developing between academy management and the woman who had become the facility's unofficial standard of excellence. Sarah maintained her professional composure, but something in her posture suggested she was prepared for whatever challenge Brad intended to present. "Sir," she replied evenly, "safety oversight includes preventing unsafe shooting conditions. Inaccurate windage calculations create risk of ricochets and backstop failures. I'm correcting a potentially dangerous situation." Brad's face flushed with anger at what he perceived as public contradiction of his authority. He had intended to demonstrate his expertise in front of paying customers, and Sarah's intervention had exposed his limitations to people whose respect he desperately needed. The humiliation demanded response, and Brad's next words would escalate the conflict beyond professional disagreement into something far more personal. "I think you're overstepping your qualifications. Hayes, range safety doesn't require advanced ballistics knowledge, and I'm not comfortable with civilian contractors providing tactical instruction to law enforcement personnel." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge, questioning not just Sarah's authority but her competence to work in an environment where lives depended on precision. The words struck deeper than Brad intended, cutting through defenses Sarah had thought were stronger. She had chosen this work precisely because she understood the stakes involved, because she knew what happened when equipment failed or training proved inadequate in situations where second chances didn't exist. But explaining that would require revealing more than she was prepared to share. "Understood, sir," she said instead, her voice carrying none of the thoughts racing through her mind. "I'll limit my observations to safety protocols only." The response satisfied Brad's need to establish dominance, but something in Sarah's tone suggested that this conversation was far from over. As training resumed under Brad's direct supervision, Sarah returned to her control position with new understanding of the challenge she faced. Brad wasn't simply incompetent. He was dangerous, willing to risk student safety to protect his image as the Academy's tactical authority. His next demonstration would prove just how dangerous that combination could be, and Sarah would be forced to choose between maintaining her anonymity and preventing a tragedy that would haunt everyone involved. The ghost was stirring with increasing intensity, and Sarah felt the careful control she had maintained for 18 months beginning to crack under pressure that demanded response. Some fights chose you regardless of how far you ran or how deep you buried your past. And Brad Kellerman was about to discover that questioning Sarah Mitchell's qualifications was the biggest mistake of his military career. The incident report landed on Brad Kellerman's desk 3 days later, and its contents made his blood pressure spike dangerously. An official complaint from the Colorado State Police Training Division, questioning the safety protocols at Clearwater Shooting Academy. After receiving concerns from attending officers about inconsistent instruction and potentially hazardous range conditions, the complaint specifically mentioned conflicting guidance between management and safety personnel during precision rifle training. Brad crumpled the report in his fist, his face flushing with rage that had been building since Sarah's public contradiction of his authority. The officers had complained directly to their supervisors, describing confusion about proper windage calculations and concern about management override of safety officer recommendations. The implication was clear and devastating to Brad's carefully constructed reputation as a tactical expert. Sarah Mitchell had humiliated him in front of paying customers, and now his business was facing official scrutiny from the very agencies that provided his most lucrative training contracts. The Academy's insurance rates would increase, regulatory inspections would intensify, and his credibility with law enforcement clients would suffer permanent damage. All because a civilian contractor had questioned his expertise in front of witnesses who mattered. The campaign against Sarah began immediately and systematically. Brad called her into his office the following morning, ostensibly for a routine performance review that had been scheduled weeks in advance. His office walls displayed photographs of him in military uniform, certificates from various tactical courses, and expensive firearms that served more as decoration than functional tools. The overall effect was intended to intimidate civilian employees who might question his authority. Sarah entered with the same professional demeanor she maintained during all interactions with management, carrying a folder containing documentation of her work performance and safety record. Her posture was relaxed but alert, the stance of someone comfortable with official scrutiny, because her record spoke for itself. She had no way of knowing that Brad had already decided her fate, regardless of any evidence she might present. "Mitchell," Brad began without preamble, settling behind his desk with the authority of someone who had never questioned his right to judge others. I've been reviewing your performance metrics, and I have some concerns about your approach to safety oversight and your interaction with Academy clients. The accusation was carefully phrased to sound like legitimate management feedback, but Sarah immediately recognized the underlying pattern. She had seen this before in different contexts with different stakes. The systematic application of pressure designed to create defensible justification for predetermined punishment. Brad wasn't conducting a performance review. He was building a case for her termination. Could you be more specific about your concerns, sir? Sarah replied evenly, opening her folder to reveal 18 months of flawless safety records, 0 incidents under her oversight, and commendation letters from visiting instructors who had praised her professionalism and expertise. The documentation represented hundreds of hours of meticulous work and consistent excellence that spoke louder than any accusation. Brad's expression suggested he considered her request for specifics a form of insubordination. He had expected submission and apology, not professional challenge backed by documented evidence. The folder in her hands represented a problem he hadn't anticipated, proof that his accusations would need to overcome an exceptional record of actual performance. Your intervention during the law enforcement training session was inappropriate and disruptive, Brad declared, his voice rising with indignation. Safety officers don't provide tactical instruction to sworn personnel, and your contradiction of my guidance created confusion that could have compromised training effectiveness. Sarah studied the man across the desk, noting his defensive posture and the way his hands gestured emphatically when he felt his authority questioned. She had learned to read people like Brad during years of service in environments where understanding human psychology meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. This was about more than professional disagreement. It was about ego, insecurity, and the desperate need to maintain an image that reality couldn't support. Sir, my intervention addressed a safety concern that could have resulted in equipment damage or personnel injury, Sarah explained calmly. The windage calculation error would have caused continued misses and potential ricochet hazards. Correcting dangerous conditions is within my authority as range safety officer. Brad's laugh carried no humor, only the bitter sound of someone whose competence had been questioned by a subordinate he considered fundamentally unqualified to judge his decisions. Windage calculations, Mitchell. You're a civilian contractor with dispatcher background. What makes you think you understand ballistics better than someone with actual military training? The question struck at the heart of Sarah's carefully constructed identity, challenging not just her professional qualifications, but her right to work in an environment where technical expertise determined life and death outcomes. She had chosen this position precisely because she understood ballistics better than most people could comprehend, because she had applied that knowledge in situations where missing meant consequences that haunted her dreams. I've completed advanced training in firearm safety and ballistics calculation, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the anger building inside her. My recommendations are based on established scientific principles and practical experience with environmental factors affecting projectile trajectory. Brad leaned forward aggressively, his territorial instincts triggered by what he perceived as unprecedented defiance from someone he considered his intellectual inferior. Experience with what, Mitchell? Shooting paper targets at civilian ranges? That's not the same as understanding tactical applications or training law enforcement personnel for real-world scenarios. The accusation revealed Brad's fundamental misunderstanding of both Sarah's background and the nature of the work she performed daily. He saw her as a pretender, someone playing at expertise she had never earned through legitimate service. The irony would have been amusing if the stakes weren't so serious, if her ability to continue serving quietly wasn't being threatened by a man whose own qualifications wouldn't have qualified him to clean her weapons during her operational years. I understand the importance of accuracy in law enforcement applications, Sarah said carefully, choosing each word to avoid revealing more than necessary while still defending her professional competence. My recommendations are designed to prevent equipment failures and ensure student safety during training exercises. Brad's response escalated the confrontation beyond professional disagreement into something approaching personal attack. Safety is important, Mitchell, but it's not the only consideration. These officers need to understand that perfection isn't achievable in real-world conditions, that sometimes good enough has to be good enough. Your obsession with precision creates unrealistic expectations. The statement revealed everything wrong with Brad's approach to training and his fundamental misunderstanding of what prepared people for survival in hostile environments. Sarah had learned in places where good enough meant dead that precision wasn't obsession but necessity, that attention to detail separated those who came home from those who didn't. But explaining that would require revealing knowledge she couldn't share. Precision saves lives, sir, Sarah replied simply, her voice carrying conviction that came from experience Brad couldn't comprehend. Students deserve training that prepares them for the highest standards they might face in operational environments. Brad's face darkened with anger at what he perceived as lecturing from someone he considered unqualified to understand operational realities. Don't presume to tell me about operational environments, Mitchell. You've never been in a situation where lives depended on your decisions, where political considerations and resource limitations forced compromises that textbook training doesn't address. The accusation struck deeper than Brad could have imagined, cutting through defenses that Sarah had thought were impenetrable. She had been in more situations where lives depended on her decisions than Brad could conceive, had made compromises that haunted her sleep and carried consequences that shaped every aspect of her current service. The man questioning her understanding of operational pressure had never faced a decision more challenging than which tactical gear to purchase for his image. I understand operational pressure, sir, Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying undertones that made Brad pause despite his anger. I also understand that proper training prevents unnecessary casualties and equipment failures that compromise mission success. Something in her tone suggested depths that Brad couldn't fathom, knowledge earned through experience he had never approached. For a moment, uncertainty flickered across his features as he sensed he might be dealing with someone whose background exceeded his assumptions. But his ego quickly reasserted itself, demanding that he maintain dominance regardless of what he didn't understand. Your contract specifically limits your authority to safety oversight, not tactical instruction, Brad declared, falling back on bureaucratic authority when professional competence failed him. I'm implementing new protocols that will clarify these boundaries and ensure that all personnel understand their proper roles within the academy structure. The threat was clear and unmistakable. Brad intended to restrict Sarah's duties to meaningless administrative tasks, removing her from the training environment where her expertise had made measurable improvements to student performance and facility safety. He would reduce her role to checking credentials and filing paperwork, eliminating her influence on the operations that gave her work meaning. Sarah recognized the pattern immediately because she had seen it used against competent people who threatened incompetent authority throughout her career. The systematic reduction of responsibility, the bureaucratic maze designed to frustrate effective personnel into resignation, the deliberate creation of impossible conditions that justified predetermined punishment. Brad was implementing a textbook campaign of harassment disguised as administrative reform. I understand, sir, Sarah replied, her voice betraying none of the calculations running through her mind. She was evaluating Brad's psychological profile, assessing his weaknesses and blind spots, developing countermeasures that would protect her position while exposing his incompetence to those who mattered. The game had rules, and Sarah had learned to play it at levels Brad couldn't comprehend. The meeting concluded with Brad's announcement that new performance metrics would be implemented immediately, with particular attention to ensuring that all personnel operated within their designated areas of responsibility. The message was received and understood by both participants. Sarah had been marked for elimination, and Brad expected her to accept his judgment without resistance. As Sarah left the office, she carried with her the certainty that this confrontation was only the beginning. Brad had revealed his intentions and his methods, providing her with intelligence she could use to protect herself and the Academy's mission. But she had also discovered something troubling about her own response to his challenge. The careful control she had maintained for 18 months was beginning to crack under pressure that demanded more than passive resistance. The wooden box in her apartment seemed to call to her as she drove home, through mountain roads that reminded her of other places where she had served without recognition. 3 sets of tags worn smooth by handling, representing comrades who had trusted her with their lives and paid the ultimate price for service to something larger than themselves. They had died believing that competence mattered more than politics, that excellence should be valued regardless of who demonstrated it. Brad's campaign threatened the only form of service she had left, the quiet dedication that allowed her to honor their memory through ensuring others would be better prepared for challenges she prayed they would never face. But his systematic harassment was forcing her to choose between maintaining her anonymity and protecting the mission that gave her life meaning. The next morning brought new evidence of Brad's determination to establish control over every aspect of Academy operations. Sarah arrived to find a memo detailing revised safety protocols that reduced her authority while expanding administrative requirements, designed to consume time she had previously spent on meaningful oversight activities. The changes were superficially reasonable, but practically destructive, creating bureaucratic obstacles that would degrade safety without providing any corresponding benefit. Mike Torres, the head instructor, approached her during the morning briefing with obvious concern about the new procedures. He was a veteran law enforcement officer who understood the difference between administrative theater and practical safety measures, and Brad's memo had raised red flags about the Academy's operational priorities. Sarah, this new protocol requires written justification for any safety intervention during training sessions, Mike said quietly, showing her the relevant section of Brad's directive. That means filling out forms while students are potentially creating dangerous conditions. It's going to create delays that could cause the exact problems we're trying to prevent. Sarah reviewed the new requirements with growing understanding of Brad's strategy. He was creating conditions where effective safety oversight would become impossible, generating documentation that could later be used to justify claims of poor performance or insubordination. Every intervention she made would require paperwork that delayed response, and every delay could be characterized as negligence or incompetence. "I understand the concern, Mike," Sarah replied carefully, aware that their conversation might be monitored or reported to management. "I'll work within the new guidelines and document everything thoroughly to ensure we maintain proper records of all safety activities." Mike's expression suggested he understood the subtext of her response. Sarah would comply with Brad's requirements while building her own documentation that could counter any accusations he might make about her performance. But both of them recognized that the new protocols would create genuine safety risks while providing Brad with weapons he could use against anyone who challenged his authority. The first test of the new system came during advanced pistol training later that morning. A student was using reloaded ammunition that showed signs of inconsistent powder charges, creating pressure variations that could damage firearms or injure the shooter. Under normal circumstances, Sarah would have immediately halted training to address the equipment issue and ensure student safety. Instead, she was required to complete a written assessment form documenting the specific nature of the concern, the regulatory basis for intervention, and the recommended corrective action before stopping the training exercise. The paperwork took precious minutes while the student continued firing potentially dangerous ammunition, creating exactly the kind of risk that safety officers were supposed to prevent. When Sarah finally called the ceasefire and addressed the ammunition problem, Brad appeared on the range with obvious satisfaction about the delay that had compromised safety in the name of administrative compliance. His expression suggested he was documenting the incident for future use, building a case that Sarah's interventions were disruptive and unnecessary rather than protective of student welfare. "Problem with the new procedures, Mitchell?" Brad asked with false concern, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer and was pleased with the demonstration of their effectiveness. "I notice it took several minutes to address what you consider a safety issue. That kind of delay disrupts training flow and creates confusion among students." Sarah understood she was being maneuvered into a trap where any response would provide Brad with ammunition for his campaign against her. If she defended the time required for paperwork, he would characterize her as making excuses for poor performance. If she criticized the new procedures, he would accuse her of insubordination and resistance to legitimate management authority. "I completed the required documentation before intervening, sir," Sarah replied neutrally, handing him the completed form that detailed the ammunition problem and the corrective action she had taken. The student's reloaded cartridges showed pressure, signs that could have caused equipment damage or injury if left uncorrected. Brad examined the paperwork with exaggerated care, making notes on his clipboard that suggested he was finding fault with her documentation rather than recognizing the legitimate safety concerns she had addressed. His performance was intended for the student and other instructors watching the interaction, demonstrating his authority while undermining confidence in Sarah's professional judgment. "Pressure signs, Mitchell?" Brad questioned with theatrical skepticism. "Are you qualified to make determinations about ammunition safety? That seems like something that should be referred to qualified personnel rather than handled by safety oversight staff." The challenge struck at Sarah's technical competence in an area where her knowledge exceeded that of anyone at the academy. She had loaded thousands of rounds for precision shooting in environments where equipment failure meant mission failure, had analyzed ammunition performance under conditions that Brad couldn't imagine. But demonstrating that expertise would require revealing background she couldn't share. "I documented the visible signs of excessive pressure and recommended professional evaluation of the ammunition," Sarah explained patiently, pointing to the relevant sections of her report. The student was advised to discontinue use of those particular cartridges until proper analysis could be completed. Brad's satisfaction with the confrontation was obvious as he found new grounds for criticism in her response. "So you're making recommendations about equipment you're not qualified to evaluate, creating unnecessary work for other staff members who have to follow up on your concerns. This is exactly the kind of overreach I was talking about in our meeting yesterday." The accusation was both unfair and dangerous, characterizing legitimate safety concerns as administrative burden while ignoring the potential consequences of failing to address equipment problems. Sarah realized that Brad had created a system where she couldn't win, where every safety intervention would be characterized as evidence of poor judgment or exceeded authority. Other instructors watched the exchange with growing discomfort, recognizing the unfairness of Brad's criticism while understanding they couldn't challenge management authority without risking their own positions. Sarah appreciated their silent support, but she also understood the reality of their situation. Brad's authority extended throughout the academy, and none of them could afford to make him an enemy. As the day progressed, Sarah found herself thinking about the wooden box in her apartment and the names it contained. 3 comrades who had trusted her judgment in situations where being wrong meant consequences far more serious than administrative discipline. They had died believing in something larger than themselves, serving something more important than personal survival or professional advancement. Their sacrifice demanded that she protect the safety standards that kept others alive, Even when that protection required revealing capabilities she had worked to keep hidden. Brad's campaign was forcing her to choose between her anonymity and her duty, between maintaining her cover and honoring the memory of those who had died trusting her, to make the right decisions when everything was at stake. The ghost was stirring with increasing intensity, and Sarah felt the careful control she had maintained for 18 months, beginning to fracture under pressure that demanded response. Some battles chose you regardless of how far you ran or how deep you buried your past, and Brad Kellerman was about to discover that questioning Sarah Mitchell's competence was the greatest tactical error of his civilian life. That evening, as Sarah sat in her apartment, reviewing the day's events and planning her response to Brad's escalating campaign, she opened the wooden box for the first time in months. The 3 sets of tags felt heavier than she remembered, worn, smooth by years of handling and weighted with memories that shaped every decision she made. Each name represented someone who had believed in excellence over politics, competence over connections, and mission success over personal recognition. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as Brad continued his systematic effort to undermine her position and eliminate her influence on Academy operations. But tonight, surrounded by reminders of service that transcended individual recognition, Sarah Mitchell began planning a response that would honor both her fallen comrades and the students whose lives depended on the training they received at Clearwater Academy. The war between Brad Kellerman and Sarah Mitchell was about to escalate beyond administrative harassment into something that would test both their commitments to the principles they claimed to serve. And in that test, only one of them understood what true service actually cost. The call came at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, jarring Sarah from the light sleep that had replaced genuine rest since Brad's campaign intensified. Jessica Chun's voice trembled through the phone, the young instructor barely maintaining composure as she described the incident that would change everything at Clearwater Academy. "Sarah, there's been an accident," Jessica whispered, her words rushed and frightened. "One of the rifles malfunctioned during evening training. Nobody was hurt, thank God, but the bolt face shattered and sent metal fragments everywhere. The student could have been blinded, or worse." Sarah was already reaching for her clothes, her mind automatically shifting into crisis mode as she processed the information. Equipment failures of that magnitude didn't happen randomly. They resulted from maintenance issues, ammunition problems, or safety protocol violations that should have been caught during routine inspections. The fact that it occurred during evening training, when Brad often supervised personally, raised immediate red flags about the circumstances involved. "Which rifle, Jessica? And who was supervising the session?" Sarah asked, pulling on her boots while cradling the phone against her shoulder. Her apartment's silence felt oppressive as she prepared to return to the academy under circumstances she had hoped never to face. "The Remington 700 in position 3, the one that failed inspection last week," Jessica replied, her voice carrying implications that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Brad signed off on returning it to service after what he called minor adjustments. He said your rejection was overly cautious and that the rifle was perfectly safe for training use." The information confirmed Sarah's worst fears about the consequences of Brad's interference with safety protocols. She had identified pressure signs in that rifle's chamber that indicated metal fatigue requiring professional evaluation, but Brad had overruled her recommendation and authorized continued use despite clear evidence of potential failure. His need to demonstrate authority had created exactly the kind of dangerous situation that safety officers existed to prevent. Sarah arrived at the academy to find emergency vehicles departing and Brad conducting damage control with the affected student and witness instructors. The scene was carefully staged to minimize the apparent severity of the incident, with Brad emphasizing the protective equipment that had prevented injury while downplaying the mechanical failure that could have caused catastrophic harm. The shattered rifle lay on the bench like evidence of negligence disguised as accident, its bolt face destroyed by pressure that had exceeded safe operating limits. Metal fragments were embedded in the shooting bench and scattered across the immediate area, creating a debris pattern that told the story of an explosion contained only by the rifle's heavy barrel and the student's fortunate positioning. Mike Torres approached Sarah with obvious relief, his expression mixing gratitude for her arrival with concern about the implications of what had occurred. As head instructor, he understood that equipment failures of this magnitude triggered insurance investigations, regulatory reviews, and potential liability issues that could destroy the Academy's reputation and business prospects. "Sarah, thank God you're here," Mike said quietly, leading her away from Brad's damage control performance. "The student is shaken, but physically unharmed. Jessica and I were in the next bay when it happened, and the sound was like a grenade going off. If that bolt had failed differently, we could be dealing with a fatality instead of property damage." Sarah examined the destroyed rifle with professional detachment, cataloging the failure patterns and reconstructing the sequence of events that had led to catastrophic malfunction. The evidence was clear and damning. The chamber pressure had exceeded safe limits because the rifle had been returned to service, despite showing clear signs of metal fatigue that made continued use dangerous. "This is exactly what I documented in my inspection report," Sarah said, her voice carrying controlled anger that made Mike look at her with new understanding. The chamber showed stress fractures and pressure signs that required immediate removal from service. Brad overruled my recommendation and authorized continued use despite clear safety concerns. Mike's expression darkened as he realized the implications of what Sarah was telling him. Brad's interference with safety protocols hadn't just created administrative friction. It had nearly caused serious injury or death to a student whose family had trusted the Academy to provide training in a controlled, safe environment. The liability exposure was enormous, and the potential criminal consequences were even worse. "Do you have documentation of your original recommendation?" Mike asked, understanding that Sarah's paperwork might be the only thing standing between the Academy and complete destruction of its reputation and legal standing. Sarah nodded grimly, knowing that her meticulous record-keeping would provide clear evidence of both the danger she had identified and Brad's decision to ignore her professional judgment. The paper trail would show that she had followed proper protocols while Brad had prioritized his authority over student safety, creating a situation that could have resulted in tragedy. The investigation began immediately, triggered by the insurance company's requirement for detailed analysis of any equipment failure that created potential liability exposure. State regulatory officials arrived the following morning, accompanied by federal inspectors whose presence indicated that the incident had attracted attention from agencies with authority to shut down the Academy permanently. Sarah found herself at the center of the investigation, her documentation and expertise crucial to understanding what had happened and why. The investigators were experienced professionals who understood firearms and safety protocols, and they immediately recognized the significance of her pre-incident warnings about the rifle that had eventually failed catastrophically. "Miss Mitchell," said Captain Robert Hayes from the State Police Regulatory Division, settling across from her in the Academy's conference room with a thick folder of documents. "Your inspection reports show exceptional attention to detail and consistent identification of potential safety issues. Can you walk us through your assessment of the rifle that failed and the circumstances surrounding its return to service?" Sarah opened her own files, revealing 18 months of meticulous documentation that painted a picture of professional competence and safety consciousness that impressed even experienced investigators. Her reports were models of clarity and precision, identifying problems and recommending solutions with the kind of expertise that suggested training far beyond basic safety certification. On October 15th, I identified stress fractures in the chamber area of Rifle 773, along with pressure signs indicating metal fatigue that could lead to catastrophic failure. Sarah began, pointing to photographs and detailed measurements that supported her conclusions. I recommended immediate removal from service pending professional evaluation by a qualified gunsmith. Captain Hayes examined the documentation with obvious appreciation for its thoroughness and technical accuracy. Sarah's reports included photographic evidence, precise measurements, and detailed analysis that exceeded the standards typically seen from civilian safety officers. Her work demonstrated knowledge of metallurgy and pressure dynamics that suggested background in advanced firearms technology. "This is exceptionally detailed analysis," Hayes commented. Studying the photographs that clearly showed the stress patterns Sarah had identified weeks before the actual failure. "Your recommendation was unambiguous and well supported by physical evidence. What happened after you submitted this report?" Sarah's expression remained neutral as she described Brad's response to her safety concerns, but the investigators could hear the controlled anger in her voice as she detailed his decision to override her recommendations without proper technical justification. The story that emerged painted a picture of management interference with safety protocols that had created predictable and preventable danger. "Mr. Kellerman disagreed with my assessment and authorized return to service after what he characterized as minor adjustments," Sarah explained, producing Brad's written authorization that contradicted her safety recommendation. "He stated that my evaluation was overly cautious and that the rifle posed no significant risk to users." The investigators exchanged glances that suggested Brad's position was becoming increasingly precarious as the evidence mounted against his judgment and decision-making. Their experience with firearms accidents had taught them to recognize the patterns that led to preventable tragedies, and Brad's interference with qualified safety recommendations fit the profile of negligent management that courts treated harshly. Captain Hayes continued questioning Sarah about her background and qualifications, probing for the source of her expertise in areas that exceeded typical safety officer training. Her answers were carefully measured, revealing sufficient knowledge to establish credibility without providing details about experiences she couldn't discuss openly. "Miss Mitchell, your technical analysis suggests advanced training in firearms metallurgy and pressure dynamics," Hayes observed, his tone indicating professional curiosity rather than suspicion. "Could you describe your educational background and previous experience that prepared you for this level of technical evaluation?" Sarah had prepared for this question, knowing that the investigation would naturally focus on her qualifications to make the judgments that had proven accurate and potentially life-saving. Her response balanced honesty with necessary discretion, revealing enough to establish credibility without exposing information that remained classified. "I completed advanced firearms technology courses through several professional development programs, with particular focus on failure analysis and prevention," Sarah replied, providing documentation of civilian certifications that supported her claimed expertise. "My previous work required detailed understanding of equipment reliability and safety margins in high-stress applications." The answer satisfied the investigators while maintaining the careful ambiguity that protected her true background. Hayes nodded approvingly, understanding that Sarah possessed legitimate expertise regardless of its civic origins, and that her warnings about the failed rifle had been based on sound technical analysis rather than excessive caution. The investigation expanded to include Brad's overall management of Academy safety protocols, revealing a pattern of decisions that prioritized his authority over qualified professional recommendations. Other instructors provided testimony about incidents where Brad had overruled safety concerns, ignored equipment problems, and created conditions that increased risk without corresponding benefits. Jessica Chun's statement was particularly damaging to Brad's position, describing multiple occasions when he had dismissed safety concerns raised by instructors and students. Her testimony painted a picture of systematic disregard for safety protocols in favor of maintaining management authority, creating an environment where preventable accidents became increasingly likely. Mr. Kellerman frequently stated that the Academy's safety standards were too restrictive and that real-world training required acceptance of reasonable risk. Jessica told the investigators, her voice steady despite obvious nervousness about contradicting management. He characterized safety concerns as obstacles to effective training rather than necessary protections for student welfare. The investigation also revealed financial pressures that had influenced Brad's decision-making, including pressure to reduce equipment replacement costs and maintain training schedules that generated revenue. His override of Sarah's safety recommendation had been motivated partly by the expense of professional rifle evaluation and the lost income from equipment removed from service. Mike Torres provided context about the Academy's declining reputation under Brad's management, describing the loss of training contracts and exodus of experienced instructors who had disagreed with his approach to safety and training standards. His testimony established that Brad's interference with safety protocols was part of a broader pattern of poor judgment that had damaged the Academy's operational effectiveness. "We've lost 3 major law enforcement contracts in the past year," Mike explained to the investigators, his professional frustration evident despite his careful tone. Agencies cited concerns about inconsistent training standards and safety protocols that didn't meet their requirements for officer training programs. As the investigation progressed, Sarah found herself in an increasingly visible position as the primary witness whose documentation and expertise were crucial to understanding the incident. Her role as the safety officer who had identified and attempted to prevent the exact failure that occurred made her a central figure in determining both the causes of the accident and the appropriate response. The media attention that accompanied the investigation created additional pressure for all involved parties. Local news outlets covered the story as an example of workplace safety issues, while industry publications focused on the implications for firearms training facilities throughout the region. Sarah's name appeared in reports as the safety officer whose warnings had been ignored, bringing unwanted attention to someone who had worked hard to remain anonymous. Brad's response to the investigation revealed his desperation as evidence mounted against his judgment and management decisions. He attempted to characterize Sarah's safety concerns as overly technical and impractical, arguing that she lacked the operational experience necessary to understand the balance between safety and training effectiveness. Miss Mitchell's recommendations would have removed half our training equipment from service based on theoretical concerns that have no basis in practical experience, Brad told investigators during his formal interview, his voice carrying the defensive tone of someone whose authority had been challenged by superior competence. Safety is important, but it must be balanced against the mission requirements of preparing students for real-world applications. The argument revealed Brad's fundamental misunderstanding of both safety protocols and the investigation process. His characterization of Sarah's warnings as theoretical concerns was contradicted by the physical evidence of the rifle failure, while his emphasis on mission requirements ignored the fact that equipment failures compromised rather than enhanced training effectiveness. Captain Hayes responded to Brad's defense with the patience of someone accustomed to dealing with negligent management attempting to justify poor decisions. Mr. Kellerman, Miss Mitchell's concerns proved to be accurate predictions of exactly what occurred. The rifle failed in precisely the manner she warned about, creating danger that could have resulted in serious injury or death. The investigation's findings were comprehensive and damning to Brad's position as Academy director. The report documented clear evidence of management interference with safety protocols, systematic disregard for qualified professional recommendations, and creation of dangerous conditions that had resulted in preventable equipment failure. More significantly for Sarah, the investigation had revealed her expertise to people who understood its value and implications. Captain Hayes and other officials recognized that her technical knowledge and safety consciousness exceeded normal civilian contractor qualifications, suggesting background that warranted further attention and possibly different responsibilities. The formal recommendation that emerged from the investigation called for immediate changes in academy management and safety oversight, with specific requirements for qualified technical evaluation of equipment concerns and prohibition of management. Override of safety officer recommendations without documented technical justification. Brad's position became untenable as insurance companies, regulatory agencies, and potential clients lost confidence in his ability to maintain safe training conditions. The investigation had exposed his limitations while highlighting Sarah's competence, creating a situation where his continued leadership threatened the academy's survival. For Sarah, the investigation marked the end of her anonymity and the beginning of recognition that would force her to confront questions about her background and qualifications that she had hoped to avoid. The careful cover she had maintained for 18 months was beginning to unravel, under scrutiny from people trained to recognize expertise and investigate its origins. The wooden box in her apartment seemed to call to her with increasing urgency, as Sarah realized that her choice was no longer between hiding and serving, but between maintaining her cover and accepting the responsibilities that her demonstrated competence demanded. The ghost was stirring, and circumstances were conspiring to bring it fully into the light. The evening after the investigation concluded its initial phase, Sarah sat in her apartment, reviewing the day's developments and their implications for her future at the academy and in Pine Ridge. The investigation had vindicated her professional judgment while exposing Brad's negligence, but it had also attracted attention to her qualifications that could lead to questions she wasn't prepared to answer. Captain Hayes had left his business card with a handwritten note expressing interest in discussing potential opportunities that might better utilize her obvious expertise. The message was professionally phrased but clearly indicated that serious people had noticed her capabilities and were wondering how someone with her knowledge had ended up as a safety officer at a civilian training facility. The choice she faced was becoming clearer with each passing day. She could continue attempting to maintain her anonymity while working under increasing scrutiny, or she could step forward and accept the recognition that her competence demanded. Either path carried risks, but only one offered the possibility of honoring her fallen comrades through service that matched the expertise they had died believing in. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the investigation entered its final phase, and Brad's desperation drove him to increasingly desperate measures to protect his position and reputation. Sarah Mitchell was about to discover that some battles couldn't be won through patience and professional competence alone, and that revealing her true capabilities might be the only way to protect the mission that gave her life meaning. The phone call that shattered Sarah's carefully constructed world came at dawn on a Friday morning, 3 weeks after the investigation had officially concluded with Brad's termination and the academy's placement under temporary state oversight. Captain Hayes's voice carried an urgency that made her stomach clench with familiar dread, the tone of someone delivering news that would change everything. "Sarah, we need to talk immediately," Hayes said without preamble, his professional composure strained by whatever he had discovered. "I'm outside your apartment. There are some things about your background that we need to discuss, and they can't wait for normal business hours." Sarah felt the walls of her anonymity crumbling as she realized that someone with investigative authority had penetrated the carefully constructed identity she had maintained for 18 months. The inevitable moment had arrived when her past would collide with her present, forcing her to confront questions she had hoped never to answer while living under her assumed identity. She dressed quickly and met Hayes in the parking lot, noting the unmarked vehicle and the presence of another officer whose bearing suggested federal rather than state authority. The setup indicated that whatever Hayes had discovered was significant enough to warrant coordination between multiple agencies, a development that filled Sarah with apprehension about the scope of their knowledge. "Miss Mitchell," Hayes began, his tone respectful but insistent, Or should I say Sergeant First Class Sarah Elizabeth Daniels, formerly of the 75th Ranger Regiment and attached to classified special operations, units whose activities remain sealed under national security provisions. The use of her real name hit Sarah like a physical blow, confirming that her deepest fears about discovery had been realized. Someone with sufficient clearance and investigative resources had penetrated the identity protection that was supposed to keep her past buried beneath layers of classification and bureaucratic misdirection. "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah replied automatically, falling back on the denial protocols she had been trained to use if her cover was ever compromised. But even as she spoke the words, she could see in Hayes's expression that he possessed evidence that made continued deception impossible. Hayes opened a folder containing documents that Sarah recognized with growing dread as classified personnel records, commendation citations, and operational summaries that should have been accessible only to people with the highest levels of security clearance. The breadth of information suggested that her exposure had come from sources within the intelligence community rather than routine law enforcement investigation. "Sergeant Daniels, your service record includes 247 confirmed eliminations across 14 countries, with the longest confirmed kill at 2,847 meters using a Barrett M82A1 in Afghanistan." Hayes read from documents that contained details Sarah thought would never see daylight. "You hold the distinction of being the only female graduate of Army Sniper School to complete the course without modified standards, and your accuracy ratings exceeded those of any previous graduate." Each detail landed with devastating precision, revealing not just her identity, but the scope of her capabilities and the legend she had built during years of operational service. Sarah felt the careful anonymity she had cultivated dissolving under the weight of documentation that exposed every aspect of her military career. The federal officer, who introduced himself as Special Agent Marcus Webb from the Department of Defense's Personnel Security Division, took over the briefing with an authority that suggested this conversation had been planned at levels far above local law enforcement. His presence indicated that Sarah's discovery had triggered protocols designed to manage security risks associated with classified personnel operating under assumed identities. "Sergeant Daniels, your current status shows administrative separation. Following the incident in Kandahar province that resulted in the loss of your entire team," Webb continued, consulting records that contained information Sarah had tried to forget. "Your psychological evaluation recommended extended leave and counseling support, but you disappeared from military oversight 18 months ago." The mention of Kandahar brought memories flooding back with painful intensity, forcing Sarah to 50C. Confront the trauma that had driven her to seek anonymity and quiet service. Her team's death had been the result of intelligence failures and inadequate support that left them exposed to overwhelming enemy forces, a tragedy that had shattered her faith in the system she had served with distinction. "My team died because someone made decisions based on politics rather than operational reality," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of loss and guilt that had shaped every day since the incident. "I couldn't continue serving in a system that valued image over the lives of people who trusted it to make competent decisions." Hayes and Webb exchanged glances that suggested they understood the psychological dynamics that had driven Sarah to abandon her military identity and seek meaning through civilian service. Their files contained details about the Kandahar incident that explained both her exceptional qualifications and her reluctance to continue operating at classified levels. "The current situation at Clearwater Academy presents us with an unusual opportunity," Webb explained, his tone shifting from interrogation to recruitment as he outlined the purpose of their early morning visit. "Your demonstration of expertise during the equipment failure investigation has attracted attention from people who understand the value of your capabilities." Sarah listened with growing apprehension as Webb described a proposal that would formalize her role at the academy while providing her with official backing to establish training programs that could benefit law enforcement and military personnel throughout the region. The offer represented recognition of her expertise, but it also meant abandoning the anonymity that had provided psychological refuge from her past. "We're not asking you to return to classified operations," Hayes clarified, understanding her reluctance to re-engage with the military structure that had failed her team. "We're proposing that you step forward as Sarah Mitchell, a civilian contractor with exceptional qualifications, and accept responsibility for developing advanced training programs that could save lives." The proposal forced Sarah to confront the choice she had been avoiding since her arrival at Pine Ridge. She could continue hiding behind her constructed identity, serving quietly while avoiding the recognition that might lead to uncomfortable questions, or she could step forward and use her expertise to train others in skills that might prevent them from experiencing the losses that haunted her dreams. "What about Brad Kellerman?" Sarah asked, understanding that her acceptance of an expanded role would inevitably bring her into conflict with the man whose negligence had nearly caused tragedy. "He still has connections in the industry, and he's not going to accept being replaced by someone he considers a civilian contractor." Webb's smile carried implications that made Sarah understand that Brad's future had already been determined by forces beyond his control or influence. "Mr. Kellerman's certifications have been revoked by multiple agencies following the investigation findings. His ability to operate training facilities or obtain insurance coverage has been permanently compromised by his documented negligence and safety violations." The information provided Sarah with satisfaction that justice had been served, but it also highlighted the broader implications of accepting the role being offered to her. She would be stepping into a position of authority and visibility that would make her a target for anyone who disagreed with her methods or resented her rapid advancement over more traditional candidates. "There's something else you need to know," Hayes said, producing another document that made Sarah's heart race with apprehension. "Brad has been making inquiries about your background through private investigation services. He's convinced that you're hiding something that explains your expertise, and he's determined to find information he can use to discredit you." The revelation that Brad was actively investigating her past created a new level of urgency about the choice she faced. If private investigators were probing her background, they might eventually discover connections that would expose her true identity without the protection that official recognition could provide. Her options were narrowing to acceptance of the offered position or complete disappearance from Pine Ridge. Sarah found herself thinking about the wooden box in her apartment and the 3 sets of tags that represented comrades who had died believing in something larger than personal survival. They had trusted her judgment in situations where being wrong meant death, and they had died believing that their sacrifice would be honored through continued service to the principles they had embodied. "I need time to consider your proposal," Sarah said finally, understanding that her decision would determine not just her future, but her ability to honor the memory of those who had died under her command. "This represents a significant change from the life I've built here, and I need to ensure that I'm making the right choice for the right reasons." Webb nodded with understanding, providing her with contact information and a secure communication method for delivering her decision within 72 hours. The timeline reflected the urgency of the situation created by Brad's investigation and the potential security implications of her continued exposure without official protection. As the officers departed, Sarah returned to her apartment with the understanding that her 18 months of anonymity were ending whether she chose to step forward or disappear completely. The investigation had exposed her capabilities to people who valued expertise over politics, but it had also made her a target for those who resented competence they couldn't understand or control. The weekend passed in solitary reflection as Sarah weighed her options and their implications for both her personal peace and her ability to serve others effectively. The quiet life she had built in Pine Ridge had provided healing and purpose, but it had also been a form of hiding that might no longer be sustainable given the attention her expertise had attracted. Monday morning brought her decision along. With a new understanding of her responsibilities to both the living and the dead, Sarah called the number Webb had provided and delivered a response that would transform her from a hidden refugee from classified service into a recognized expert whose influence would extend far beyond the Colorado mountains. "I'll accept the position with two conditions," Sarah told Webb during their secure conversation. "First, my team's service and sacrifice must be properly honored through memorial recognition that acknowledges their contribution to national security. Second, the training programs I develop must emphasize the fundamentals that prevent avoidable casualties, rather than promoting tactics that look impressive but lack practical application." Webb's immediate acceptance of her conditions confirmed that serious people understood both the value of her expertise and the psychological factors that had driven her to seek anonymity. The memorial recognition would provide closure she had been unable to achieve through individual mourning, while the training focus would ensure that her knowledge served to prevent rather than facilitate the kind of losses that had shattered her faith in military competence. The transformation of Clearwater Academy under Sarah's acknowledged leadership began immediately, with state funding and federal oversight providing resources that Brad's incompetent management had never accessed. Advanced training programs attracted students from across the region, while Sarah's reputation for uncompromising standards and practical expertise drew instructors whose qualifications matched the facility's enhanced mission. Jessica Chin became Sarah's primary assistant, absorbing lessons about leadership, technical competence, and the responsibility that came with training people whose lives might depend on the skills they developed. Her growth from nervous instructor to confident professional demonstrated the potential for excellence when proper mentorship replaced political maneuvering. "The most important thing you can teach anyone," Sarah explained to Jessica during one of their morning preparation sessions, "is that precision isn't perfectionism. It's the discipline to do things correctly every time because you understand that someone's life might depend on your attention to detail." Mike Torres accepted the position of deputy director, bringing operational experience and administrative skills that complemented Sarah's technical expertise. Together, they developed training curricula that emphasized fundamentals over flashy techniques, building programs that prepared students for real-world challenges rather than range competitions. The Academy's reputation for excellence spread throughout law enforcement and military communities, as word spread about training programs that produced measurably improved performance in operational environments. Sarah's insistence on practical application over theoretical knowledge created graduates who could perform under stress with equipment they understood completely. Brad Kellerman's attempt to establish a competing facility failed within 6 months, as his inability to obtain insurance coverage or attract qualified instructors made sustainable operations impossible. His private investigation into Sarah's background had revealed nothing beyond her exceptional qualifications and the respect she commanded from students and colleagues throughout the region. The memorial service for Sarah's fallen team was held at Arlington National Cemetery on a crisp autumn morning that reminded her of the mountains where she had found peace and purpose. Captain Hayes, Special Agent Webb, and dozens of military personnel whose lives had been touched by her team's service gathered to honor sacrifices that had remained classified until official recognition finally provided acknowledgement of their contribution. Sarah stood before the memorial wall with the 3 sets of tags she had carried for so long, finally able to lay them to rest in a place where their sacrifice would be properly honored. The ceremony provided closure she had been unable to achieve. Through individual mourning, transforming her guilt into purpose and her loss into legacy. "They died believing in something larger than themselves," Sarah said during her eulogy, her voice carrying across the assembled gathering with quiet strength. Their sacrifice demands that we serve with the same commitment to excellence they demonstrated, that we prepare others for challenges they might face, and that we never forget the cost of freedom or the responsibility it places on those who survive. The years that followed saw Clearwater Academy become a model for training facilities throughout the nation, with Sarah's programs being adopted by agencies that recognized the value of instruction, based on practical experience rather than theoretical knowledge. Her influence extended through every student she trained, every instructor she mentored, and every standard she established that emphasized competence over politics. Students who completed her programs carried her lessons into operational environments around the world, applying fundamentals that kept them alive in situations where precision determined survival. Their success validated her belief that proper training could prevent the kind of losses that had driven her to seek anonymity and quiet service. The wooden box in her apartment was replaced by photographs of students who had completed her programs, letters from graduates describing successful operations, and commendations from agencies whose personnel had benefited from training that prepared them for real-world challenges. The transition from mourning the dead to celebrating the living marked her complete emergence from the shadows that had sheltered her grief. Sarah Mitchell, formerly Sergeant Sarah Elizabeth Daniels, had found a way to honor her fallen comrades through service that extended their legacy rather than simply preserving their memory. The ghost had risen from hiding to become something more powerful than any legend, a teacher whose influence would save lives for generations to come. The Academy's success attracted national attention and federal funding that enabled expansion into advanced programs serving special operations personnel and federal law enforcement agencies. Sarah's reputation for uncompromising standards and practical expertise made Clearwater Academy the destination of choice for personnel who needed training that could make the difference between mission success and tragic failure. On quiet mornings, when mist clung to the Colorado mountains, Sarah still performed her ritual of precision shooting at distances that challenged belief. But now she did so in the company of students who understood that they were witnessing something extraordinary, learning from someone whose expertise had been earned through experience they couldn't fully comprehend. The rifle spoke with authority that silenced doubts and demonstrated truth through impact that brooked no argument. At 1,247 yards, through swirling wind and shifting light, bullets found their marks with surgical precision that reminded everyone present that excellence needed no announcement beyond the simple demonstration of capability. Students learned to trust their equipment and their training, understanding that precision was achievable through discipline and attention to detail rather than natural talent or expensive gear. Sarah's instruction emphasized fundamentals that enabled performance under stress, preparing them for situations where their lives and the lives of others would depend on their ability to perform when everything else failed. The legend of the Harmless safety officer, who had become the nation's premier firearms instructor, spread through military and law enforcement communities as testament to the power of competence over politics, expertise over authority, and service over self-promotion. Sarah Mitchell had proven that true strength lay not in hiding from recognition, but in accepting the responsibility that expertise demanded. Her story became inspiration for others who had been underestimated or overlooked, demonstrating that excellence would eventually be recognized by those who valued substance over image. The quiet woman who had cleaned weapons and enforced safety protocols had transformed into an instructor whose influence would be felt for generations through every life she helped save. The rifle had spoken, and silence had followed, the kind of silence that comes when doubt is eliminated by demonstration, when questions are answered by results, and when legends are born not through self-promotion, but through service that speaks louder than words ever could. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.